Have you ever wondered what happens when a marriage falls apart? Not because of, the usual things like infidelity or abuse,
Mm.
but because one person is considered like psychologically incapacitated.
Yeah.
It's a pretty complex legal concept,
hmm
and we're diving deep into a Philippine Supreme Court case that really tackles this head on.
Oh, interesting.
It's Ma Virginia D.R. Halog versus Wilbur Francis G. Halog.
Okay.
And it really sheds light on how, like, personal struggles and legal definitions kind of intersect. So we're going to break down the facts of the case, the decisions made by the lower courts, and then ultimately we'll get to the Supreme Court's ruling on the matter. Sound good?
Sounds fascinating. Let's do it.
Okay, so this case, GR No 231695, decided on October 6, 2021, starts with Ma Virginia filing for an annulment
Okay.
based on Wilbur's alleged psychological incapacity.
hmm
And get this, Wilbur didn't even show up to defend himself in court.
Wow. That's pretty telling right from the start. Makes you wonder what would lead to, completely disengaging from the legal process like that. Yeah.
Ma. Virginia's story paints a pretty challenging picture of their relationship. She alleges abuse, infidelity,
Hmm.
and even abandonment.
Those are some serious accusations.
Yeah.
And are those allegations supported by any other evidence?
They are. Her brother and her best friend both gave testimonies,
Oh, wow.
offering a perspective from outside of the immediate relationship.
Yeah.
And they actually described Wilbur as someone who was troubled even before the marriage,
Hmm.
suggesting that this pattern of behavior kind of extended beyond just their relationship.
So you're saying there were like red flags even before the I do's?
Oh, yeah. They even point to instances of infidelity before the wedding.
Okay, so let's rewind a bit. How did this couple even get together in the first place?
So they initially connected through phone calls
Okay.
and quickly became a couple.
Mm-hmm.
But, yeah, there were some red flags early on.
Like the affair you mentioned.
Exactly. And things didn't really improve after they got married.
Okay.
Ma. Virginia describes their marriage as kind of a constant struggle.
Oh, no.
Lots of arguments. Lack of intimacy.
So like a fundamental disconnect.
Yeah. Affecting both the emotional and physical aspects of their relationship.
Right.
She even said that Wilbur seemed to regret marrying her pretty much from the beginning,
Oh, wow.
often expressing that he, wasn't ready for that kind of commitment and prioritized providing for his own family over their life together.
This sounds like what the courts refer to as juridical antecedents, right? Like, were these issues already present before the marriage even happened?
Exactly.
Or did they develop as a result of the marriage itself?
That's a key question.
Yeah.
So we've got these cracks in the foundation even before they say, I do. What happens next?
Well, tell me more about what unfolded after the marriage. Did things escalate?
Well, Mar Virginia alleges that despite, his claims of prioritizing family, Wilbur continued to engage in multiple extramarital affairs,
Oh, wow.
including one with his secretary.
So his actions were directly contradicting his words.
Yeah, it raises serious concerns about, his capacity for commitment and fidelity. And to make things even more complicated, their business ventures together started experiencing some difficulties.
Financial strain can put a lot of pressure on a marriage, right?
Definitely. It often, exacerbates existing issues.
Right.
And that's precisely what Ma Virginia says happened.
Okay.
She claims that during this period, Wilbur became even more abusive,
Oh, no.
culminating in a terrifying incident where he allegedly pointed a gun at her.
That's a serious escalation of conflict
Yeah.
and a clear indication of a dangerous and volatile environment. Especially with children involved, it adds another layer of concern,
Yeah.
thinking about the potential impact on their well-being.
It's a heartbreaking situation
Absolutely.
on multiple levels. And then things take another turn. Wilbur decides to move to Qatar for work, leaving Ma Virginia to manage their network business back home.
So now there's physical distance added to the mix.
Yeah.
Which can sometimes, help a relationship, but often can just strain it further.
And in this case, it seemed to initially improve their communication. But it didn't last.
Right.
Ma. Virginia testifies that Wilbur kind of reverted back to his old ways.
In what way?
Verbally abusive.
Oh.
Belittling her,
Yeah.
calling her names like idiot and stupid whenever she made a mistake with the business.
It sounds like a pattern of disrespect and emotional abuse.
Yeah, regardless of, the physical distance. And it actually extended to their children, too.
Oh, no, really?
When their daughter was diagnosed with dyslexia, Wilbur, he allegedly blamed Ma Virginia for it
Oh, wow.
and neglected his responsibilities as a father.
That raises questions about his ability to empathize, be accountable, and truly fulfill the essential obligations of being a parent.
Exactly.
So what happened next? Did things just continue to deteriorate?
It gets worse. Ma, Virginia, makes a shocking discovery. She finds out that Wilbur's not only living with another woman in Qatar,
Oh my gosh.
he's actually married her.
Wow, that's a significant betrayal.
Yeah, she actually presented evidence to support this claim.
What kind of evidence?
A report of marriage from the Philippine embassy in Doha
Okay.
and a report of birth for their child.
Wow. That definitely paints a clear picture of his actions.
Yeah. And to further support her case, she called on two key witnesses,
Okay.
her brother Joseph
Mm-hmm.
and her close friend Jessica.
So they provided firsthand accounts.
They did, corroborating Ma, Virginia's claims about Wilbur's behavior both before and during their marriage.
So their testimonies helped to create a more comprehensive narrative.
Exactly. They helped establish a pattern of behavior that wasn't just, isolated incidents.
Right.
It really suggested a deeper issue at play.
So we've got a compelling story, supporting witnesses, and a respondent who's completely MIA. What happened when this case went to court?
Well, the first stop was the Regional Trial Court of Pasig City, and they ruled in favor of Ma, Virginia, agreeing that Wilbur was exhibiting signs of psychological incapacity.
So round one goes to Ma, Virginia.
It does. But I have a feeling this isn't the end of the story.
Oh, why? What happened?
Well, the Court of Appeals stepped in, and they reversed the decision.
What? Why would they overturn the lower court's ruling?
They had some reservations, particularly regarding the expert testimony that Ma, Virginia presented.
Ah, the plot thickens. Tell me more about this expert testimony and why it raised red flags for the Court of Appeals.
Well, Ma, Virginia had presented testimony from Dr. Melchor Gamantong, okay? He's a psychiatrist. And he had evaluated Ma, Virginia and concluded that she suffered from avoidant personality disorder. However,
okay, I'm sensing a but coming.
he never actually examined Wilbur directly.
Whoa, that's a pretty big detail to leave out. So how did he come to any conclusions about Wilbur's psychological state?
He based his assessment on the interviews he conducted with Ma, Virginia, her brother, and her friend, and ultimately diagnosed Wilbur with antisocial personality disorder.
So essentially, relying on secondhand information, I can definitely see why the Court of Appeals might have some concerns about that.
Yeah. They felt that the evidence, specifically the expert testimony, was too one-sided.
Mm-hmm.
And they questioned whether Dr. Gamantong's report, which was based on, these indirect observations, could truly establish Wilbur's psychological incapacity.
That's a valid point. It raises questions about how reliable and valid those conclusions actually are.
Exactly. And this disagreement between the lower courts kind of set the stage for a crucial decision by the highest court in the land of the Philippine Supreme Court.
Welcome back to our deep dive into the case of Ma, Virginia Dr. Halog versus Wilbur Francis G. Halog.
So last time, we left off with the Court of Appeals kind of throwing a wrench in things,
They did.
reversing that lower court's decision and questioning that whole expert testimony thing.
Right. They were skeptical about whether Dr. Gamantong's diagnosis of Wilbur, based only on interviews with Ma, Virginia, and her close associates, was really enough to prove psychological incapacity.
Yeah, it seemed like a pretty big point of contention.
Right.
So what did the Supreme Court have to say about all of this?
Well, this is where things get really interesting. The Supreme Court actually sided with Ma, Virginia.
No way.
They did. And they upheld the annulment.
Wow, a real plot twist. So they disagreed with the Court of Appeals then.
I did.
What was their reasoning?
So they acknowledged the concerns about the expert witness not directly examining Wilbur.
Right.
But ultimately, they decided that the other evidence presented in the case, along with Dr. Gamantong's analysis, was strong enough to support the annulment.
So they were looking at the bigger picture, not just focusing on that one piece of the puzzle. This must have been a pretty significant decision, right? I mean, did it set some kind of precedent for future cases?
Absolutely. This case really gets to the heart of Article 36 of the Family Code of the Philippines, which deals with psychological incapacity as grounds for annulment. The court had to clarify how this concept is applied in legal proceedings.
That's some pretty heavy stuff.
Yeah.
Can you break down what exactly the court focused on when they were making this decision?
Sure. They emphasized a few key things. First, they looked at what's called juridical antecedents,
Okay.
which basically means they wanted to see if Wilbur was already exhibiting these problematic behaviors before he even got married.
So was this a pattern of behavior that was already there? Or did it pop up only after they tied the knot?
Right. And based on the testimonies, particularly about his infidelity even before the wedding, The court concluded that these issues were likely present before the marriage.
So point one for Ma, Virginia.
Yeah.
It wasn't just a reaction to their marriage. What else did they consider?
Well, next they looked at the gravity of the situation.
Okay.
Were these issues just, typical marital spats?
Like bickering over who takes out the trash.
Exactly. Or were they more serious problems that really struck at the core of the marriage?
Okay.
The court determined that in this case, Wilbur's alleged abuse, infidelity, and abandonment, all backed up by those witness testimonies, really went beyond normal marital conflicts
Yeah.
and demonstrated a pretty serious inability to fulfill those essential obligations that come with marriage.
Okay, so the issues were deemed serious and pre-existing.
Yeah.
Anything else?
Yes. One more important point. They considered incurability. Could these problems have been fixed, through therapy, counseling, or other interventions?
Right.
Or were they so ingrained that the marriage was basically incompatible from the start?
So was there any hope for reconciliation? Or was the relationship just beyond repair?
Well, based on the evidence, including that history of Wilbur's actions and the patterns of behavior described, the court concluded that these issues were unlikely to be resolved.
So the court basically found that the problems were serious, they were there before the marriage, and they seem pretty much incurable. But what about that whole expert witness controversy? Did they just brush that aside?
Not at all. The Supreme Court actually used this case as an opportunity to clarify the role of expert testimony in these kinds of psychological incapacity cases. They said that while direct examination of the respondent by the expert is definitely the ideal scenario,
Yeah.
it's not always possible.
Right.
So there are situations where relying on indirect information, like in this case, is acceptable.
Interesting. So they didn't just throw out Dr. Gummentong's testimony because he hadn't interviewed Wilbur personally.
Exactly. They looked at everything carefully and determined that his analysis, even though based on indirect information, still met the standards to be considered valid and reliable.
So the Supreme Court really had to put on their detective hats here and piece together this puzzle from all the evidence they had. This case makes you wonder about the human stories that are behind these legal battles and the tough decisions that judges have to make.
It does.
So after all this back and forth, with the annulment being upheld, what ended up happening to Ma, Virginia, and Wilbur?
Well, the Supreme Court's ruling essentially dissolved their marriage as if it had never legally existed.
Okay.
This decision gave Ma Virginia a chance to move on from a relationship that had clearly caused her a lot of pain.
It's kind of a reminder that even though the legal system can seem, rigid and impersonal, it can also offer a path towards freedom.
Yeah.
Especially for those who are stuck in relationships that are harmful or just not working.
Yeah.
But it also leaves us with some lingering questions.
It does.
We've been talking about this case, and it seems like, with every layer we peel back, there are even more nuances that come up.
Yeah.
What are some of the, unanswered questions that this whole thing brings up?
Well, one thing that stands out to me is, we only heard Ma Virginia's side of the story.
Yeah.
Corroborated by, her brother and friend.
Mm-hmm.
And while the court found her to be credible, we're still missing Wilbur's perspective, his own account of what happened, and why he chose not to participate in the legal process at all.
Yeah, it makes you wonder what his side of the story would be and what led to him not even showing up.
Exactly. And it brings up a really important point about the legal system in general, that idea of due process. Everyone has the right to be heard.
Right.
So even though Wilbur's absence obviously complicated things, it also raises questions about whether his side was truly considered.
It's a reminder that even with all the rules in place to try to ensure fairness, there can still be these complexities that impact the outcome.
Definitely. Another question this case brings up is, how society understands this whole idea of psychological incapacity.
Right. It's not as simple as having a few arguments or going through a rough patch. This case really shows that it goes much deeper than that.
It does.
It's about being unable to fulfill those essential obligations of marriage. And often it's related to things that were already present in a person before they even got married.
Right. And that raises the question of how we as a society think about mental health in the context of marriage and relationships.
Yeah.
It's a complex issue.
Definitely. It's a conversation that goes way beyond the courtroom and requires a lot of sensitivity and understanding.
Absolutely. This case also makes you think about the whole expert testimony thing. The Supreme Court acknowledged the limits of Dr. Gummentong's assessment.
Right.
Because it was based on indirect observation. But they still considered it to be valid and reliable.
Yeah. It really highlights how important it is to, really scrutinize that expert testimony. Look at how they came to their conclusions, their qualifications, and the type of information they used.
Exactly. It makes you wonder about how much weight is given to an expert's opinion compared to direct evidence,
Hmm.
and how those factors are balanced when a decision is being made.
It's a good reminder that even though the legal system tries to be objective, it still involves human judgment and interpretation. This deep dive into the Halog case has been really thought-provoking, to say the least. It sheds light on, marriage, mental health, and the law, and how they all kind of intertwine.
Yeah.
It's one of those cases that leaves us with more questions than answers, but it definitely pushes us to have these deeper conversations about these really important topics. What stood out to you in this case? What are your thoughts on, psychological incapacity, expert testimony, and the whole thing? Share your insights in the comments below, and be sure to subscribe for more deep dives into these fascinating legal cases and the human stories behind them.